Hello, I'm Phoebe Boucher, Managing Editor of Raven Chronicles Press. Thank you for joining us for Raven Talk, Raven's online podcast. We are hosting monthly conversations with writers, artists, and cultural warriors. Today, multiform writer Harold TAW is talking to poet, editor, and essayist Susan Rich about her recent publication, Gallery of Postcards and Maps, a collection of essential and award-winning poems from Susan Rich's 4 books of poetry, along with a generous selection of unpublished work. There will be time for some questions from the audience and comments in chat. So either that or raise your hand and we'll have a live questions. I want to thank Jack Straw and Levi Fuller for our tech engineer this evening, Aisha. Would you please say hello and pronounce your last name for us?
Hi, I'm Ayesha Ubaytilaka, and I'm one of the recording engineers at Jack Straw.
Thank you. First, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy this land. Thanks to our co-sponsors for partial funding of all Raven programs, the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, we get Civic Partner. For Culture King County Lodging Tax, we have Arts Sustained Support Program, and the Washington State Arts Commission, Arts WA, who uses NEA funding to fund our projects. And always thanks to all our individual donors. I want to introduce Harold TAW, is a multi-form writer. His debut novel was Adventures of the Karaoke King, which was wonderful. His writing has been featured on NPR and a New York Times bestselling anthology and in the Seattle Times. Harold co-wrote a musical adaptation of Jane Austen's final novel, Persuasion, and I'd sure like to see that, which became the highest grossing show in the 40-plus year history of Seattle's Taproot Theater. He was an inaugural member of the Fifth Avenue Theater Seattle Writers Group, which is a 2-year incubator for new musicals. Harold is currently completing a novel and collaborating on a musical about parallel universes. Susan Rich is an award-winning poet, editor, and essayist. She is the author of 5 poetry collections, including the book we're going to discuss today, Gallery of Postcards and Maps, New and Collected Poems, and Cloud Pharmacy, and the Alchemist Kitchen. Rich has received awards from Penn USA and the Fulbright Foundation. Her recent poems have appeared in the New England Review, Image Journal, Poetry Ireland, and The Account. Her 6th collection, Blue Atlas, is forthcoming from Red Hen Press, which is in Pasadena, California. Susan is the co-founder and director of Poets on the Coast, a weekend poetry retreat for women. We will post hers and Harold's websites in the chat. Harold, please take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Phoebe. First of all, I just wanted to thank Raven Chronicles for this amazing series and the opportunity for writers to get together and talk about craft. It's one of those things that I think is just a real treat for all writers to just see what writers are doing and sort of the creative process and the things they've been thinking about, as they write. It's a real privilege to be here. And it's an incredible privilege to be here with my good friend, Susan Rich, who I've now known for, I believe, since around 2006, 2007. I know is before the birth of my children, who are now 13 years old. So it's been quite a while. We met, I believe, shortly after Susan's 2nd collection, which is Cures Include Travel. So I was able to celebrate the release of her 3rd collection, of course, here with a 5th collection. So it's an amazing opportunity to talk with her. Before launching into the conversation, I would actually love to be able to almost have an invocation, which is getting a poem from Susan. And so I wanted to invite Susan to start us off with a poem so we'll get an understanding of just a little bit of her work and a little bit of a glimpse. So, and the one I suggested, and I was wondering if she might read, is How to Travel in the Middle Period, which is one of her new works.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for Raven Chronicles for having us. It is a treat, especially a treat to be here with my friend Harold, who is one of only 2 strangers I have ever struck up a conversation with. And through hearing him talk on his cell phone at C&P Coffee years ago and realizing we had both gotten GAP grants and we were both using them for travel, that was the beginning of our friendship. So here's to talking to strangers who turn out to be dear friends. How to travel in the middle period. Say yes to the open scab dog that accompanies you through the village, and yes to the wood ash that rises up from the workers' rooms, to the farmer on his tractor who from across a broad distance calls to you. Bonjour, Madame, ça va? On your first Atlas Mountain morning in Umas. Say oui to the tribe of cats and wood turtles that appear along the lip of the pool, waiting for a bite of the sunbathers' bananas. Taste yes in the breakfast of argan butter and almonds. Tattoo yes to the remaining you and the changing you, to the first full body scrub. Watch as parts of you roll and scatter as the Moroccan woman leads you from the steam hall to the shower, to the bath. Yes, anointed with oils of geranium and rose. And so you've learned to travel through multiple waters and sky in the glide and drift of it, like tree goats that forage, then build their lives mid-air, knowing yes as the one chosen thing. And I'll just say a couple of words about it. I mean, people often talk about their poems before they read them, and I seem to do many things backwards, but I kind of want you to have the experience of the poem first. And I'll say that Morocco is a country that I had always wanted to go to. And when I traveled there, in the before times, in fact, it was, I think, the October before everything closed down, it didn't disappoint me at all. I just decided I needed to go back and spend more time there. And it was a trip that felt kind of luxurious, only that it's kind of far away, and that it was different. I think I did a lot of my traveling in my 20s. I slept on beaches. I ate bread and jam. I was pretty poor as a traveler. And so not that I was having a luxurious time, it was actually a yoga and meditation retreat, but compared to my traveling as a young person, it felt very different. So it was a joyous, joyous kind of life-affirming trip. And I hope some of that came through. Thanks for asking for it.
Thank you, Susan. I thought that that poem, How to Travel in the Middle Period, was a really perfect segue into the talk tonight, because what I wanted to sort of approach Susan with and talk about is this career, this journey, in poetry that has spanned now about 22 years in terms of published poetry. Of course, there's a lot that precedes all of that. And so I was really fascinated by, in the forward, Ilya Kaminsky plucked one of the lines from one of Susan's pieces, Muted Gold, referring to the lesson that journeys don't happen in straight lines. It's a wonderful line. And it's a fascinating one. For me, when I reflect back on my relationship with Susan, knowing that, if you have children, or if you've had children, or you've seen children grow up, it's weird. We have this mental image of ourselves as sort of one age, sort of floating forward, right? But when you have children, you're clearly not at one age. They just grow like crazy. They're all of a sudden from babies, all of a sudden to these humans and full adults. It's intense. And so this is also this kind of journey as a poet, going through many stages and many parts of life, and just developing as a writer. So I wanted to talk about that. I mean, I wanted to so one of the questions I wanted to ask was, in this journey spanning 5 collections and 3 decades now, what was really your entry point? Like, was poetry a lifelong fascination and craft that you finally felt ready to share with the world, or was there a time, place, or interest that brought you into the world of poetry?
Somehow we got to 30 years worth. I feel like I'm getting older as we keep talking.
Yeah, 3 decades. 3 decades.
3
You have
decades.
to span, which is kind of awesome. 22 years published, but 3 decades.
Okay, so thank you. That's a good question. And I like show and tell, so I'm really hoping that you can see this without me taking my background off. Let me see. There we go. Whoa, can you see this book kind of disappearing and reappearing? Or should I take my background off for a minute if I can do that? This is the first book of poems I ever got. That's what I'm trying to show you. And it was my sister who, oh, I do this all the time, but because I'm doing it with you all looking at me, it's not going to work, is it? Choose virtual background. There we go. I'm just going to put none for a minute so you can see it. Okay, so that's the book. It is the Oxford Book of Poetry for Children. And the inscription tells me that I was 8 years old.
Whoa.
And my sister gave it to me. And I remember not being like super excited, like, what's this thing called poetry? And, I want a story. But there's some pieces in there. There's Lewis Carroll that I still love and a few others. So that was the entry point. And I didn't become a poet because of this book. I don't remember a whole lot, except that then we had poetry in 3rd grade and we had to memorize things, and that was sort of fun. And at age 13, the town I come from, that's this, you go to school from kindergarten through 8th grade, and then you graduate to high school. And I had a great English teacher that year. And I had written this poem in sort of a frenzy. I'd had a fight with my parents, and I had gone off into my room and I'd written a poem. And I showed it to my English teacher. And before I knew it, without anyone asking me, he had shown it to the principal. And the principal thought it was a good idea to make it part of our graduation ceremony. So I was a pretty quiet kid. I wasn't someone that, got a lot of attention. But I think about that now, to have my fellow 13-year-olds having my poem come out of their mouths. They had to memorize like 4 or 5 lines. I think that did something. I think it gave poetry an importance in kind of a ceremonial way. And I should say the poem was all about identity and who am I and will I be able to make a difference in the world? So it was quite personal, and it was very much something that I think people, maybe we're always thinking, will we make a difference in the world? Who are we? But certainly as a 13-year-old, it was key. And then we'll jump ahead to college, where I majored in creative writing and had terrible, terrible teachers who went out of their way to say, oh, I don't think this is for you. Maybe you could try children's lit, which I wish I could do. I think children's lit's fantastic, but they were saying it, little girl, we can't see you as a serious poet. So I stopped writing. You're getting a longer answer than maybe you thought. I stopped writing for at least 10 years because I thought, well, these old white guys must know that I'm no good if they're going out of their way to tell me that. And it was really going into Peace Corps and living in a country in West Africa, the Republic of Niger, that was so different and so kind of flipping my world sideways and upside down in every other direction, that was one of the things that led me back to poetry. And also deciding that I didn't need to ever call myself a poet or be a poet. I finished grad school in education, and I took a watercolor class because I love watercolor, and I really am horrible. Like, no false humility. I suck. And doing watercolors was what allowed me to come back to poetry, to say, there's just joy in making. There's joy in creation. I feel good when this art is part of my life. And that was kind of the journey. And then my parents died, and I decided you only get one life. Before that, I think I thought you get many lives. I was still young, but my parents died when I was in my 30s. And I think that made me make the hard choice to leave the life I'd had, leave Amnesty International, leave Boston, and start over. I thought I was so old at the ripe age of about 38 to go towards poetry. I don't know if I answered your question. I hope so.
No, I think so. I mean, and it's, that crooked journey. I think it's fascinating, that stepping away and coming back in and exploring and finding that you have the joy in creation is amazing. I remember I was talking to, our mutual friend, poet Jane Wong, and she told me an interesting story, but basically saying that she, as a child, she's one of those children who refused to speak to the instructor. She'd just be completely silent in class. But inside her head, she's always thinking, just you wait. When I get to say something, I'm going to say so much. And that's completely true. That's completely true. So you referred to one of the sort of things that inspired you to sort of return and write had to do with your experience in the Peace Corps. This is something that, with this new collection called Gallery of Postcards and Maps that collects your 4 collections plus new poetry, you can see that there's a lot of your poetry is found inspiration in your history of travel. But I feel, I mean, and Ilya also refers to this in the foreword, but I think that it's more than just a travelogue. There's more intimacy, and it's incredibly individualized. It's not just just sensations or just external, but it's very intimate to oneself and very particular to actual people you encountered or spoke with. So I wanted, if you could talk a little bit about what people have passed in and out of your lives that have most inspired you, and are there certain places and certain sensual details that so captivated you that you had to put them down on the page?
Yeah, good question. I was thinking about this before we started tonight, and what came to me is that often the people who inspire me are women, and that I think I had to, I'm going to kind of go backwards and then answer your question. When I started writing about my experiences in Peace Corps, even though I started doing that, I guess in the early 90s, I was still very aware that I was not African. I did not come from Niger. I'm a Jewish woman from Brookline, Massachusetts. Did I have the right to tell the story of people in Niger? And for a long time, I really didn't know that I did, until I realized a couple of things. One was that nobody else was writing about Niger in English. There wasn't like there was this huge amount of poetry about West Africa. And that if I didn't start writing about it, I would soon forget. And I didn't want to do that. So I think I made a very conscious choice to only write about people that I knew directly. I wasn't going to say, this is true about West Africa, or this is true about Nigerians. I was just going to be like, Habiba lives in the same compound I do, or Mariama I see every day. And so my way of writing about other peoples, other identities, was by people I knew intimately. And by intimately, I just mean they were part of my everyday life, or I had some kind of conversation or trigger. And so 2 of the people I thought of, Harold, with this question are both people I never knew their names. So there's one poem that you asked about that maybe we'll hear later called Nomadic Life. And it focuses on the mother of one of the nomadic boys that would come to my house when I lived in Niger. It was during a time of drought, and I had this kind of group of about 20 kids that would often come by for lunch. And some of those young boys I got to be quite close with. And I'm assuming their mother was like, what the heck? Where are you going in the afternoon? Who is this woman who you're spending all this time with? And so at some point, Sa'a's mother came to see me. And so there's a poem about her, but I didn't know her name. Or when I worked in Bosnia, and we were there right after the war, working on the first ever Bosnian elections. And all of a sudden, I'm walking down a street with another electoral supervisor, and this woman drags us into her yard because she wants to thank us for being there, because we were seen kind of as peacekeepers, though that wasn't our official term. And so there's a poem for the woman from Vitez. Again, I never learned her name. So I suppose that maybe because these are people that are in my life not for a super long time, they become almost magical in my imagination. And I have a little bit of a story to go on, but then I can kind of also bring in color and scent and life. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I would say one of the influences has been these women whose lives are mysterious to me, and I'm mysterious to them, I assume. Like, who is this single woman living in Niger by herself? That was an anomaly right there.
Well, as an illustration of that, would you be willing to perhaps read that one poem that you had mentioned? It's Nomadic Life. That one's from your very first collection. So, in talking about this journey, I'd love to get something that come right at the beginning of it.
Sure, thank you. Nomadic Life, Republic of Niger. When I come back with the cups of tea, the sugar bowl has been emptied. My imported M&Ms gone. Flies stretch their legs, search, then spiral in a dust storm of light. Aisha sits solemn in afternoon heat, examines the inside of ice cubes, questions what makes water strong or weak. We invent common words between us, point at the refrigerator door, the photograph of ferns rising out of snow, the last volunteer left behind. I'd like to trade with her my typewriter keys for the way she navigates the desert, reads the coordinates of sand. I want to know, as Aisha knows, when it's time to follow the ambivalent line of landscape, keep faith in dunes that disappear. By evening, when she tastes my color-coded chocolates, shares them with her friends, we both will recall the nomad, the other woman we each might have been.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to mention that, right there is a great illustration of how so much of your poetry is really connected to everyday humanity. And in certain poems, the inhumanity at home and abroad. I'm thinking immediately of one in which that had to do with, I think, the cleanup of bodies after a bombing. So, going from, very close, intimate details of individuals to, what it's like to step into almost this surreal but real landscape. So what role do you think poetry has to play in confronting issues like this, or like our own country's slide into fascism? And what kinds of questions as an artist would you like to ask yourself and the world?
I was with you till, so I'm just going to dive in and you can kind of follow up if I'm not answering what you've asked. But that, that's kind of that question, does poetry matter? That's what I kind of translate that into. And, there's lots of things in life we can say, does this matter? Does that matter? But you brought up Ilya Kaminsky, who does the foreword for the book and who I've known for over 20 years, since he was a very young man. You may or may not know that Seattle was one of the first places that really embraced Ilya's poetry. When his first book, Dancing in Odessa, came out, he got in his car with a trunk full of books and he drove up the coast from California. And he said, Oregon, they weren't that excited about him. So he never went back to Oregon. But Seattle, a lot of people embraced him and loved him. And so he kept coming back and we became friends through that. So he's Ukrainian, and you all know what's happening in Ukraine right now. And Ilya is kind of a one-man band in trying to get people to pay attention, to particularly focus on the writers that he knows. He goes back, or used to go back, to Ukraine every summer. So I want to read you what he said. And strangely, at the moment, he's writing for Oprah magazine, for Oprah Daily. And I can only think it's because he knows he's going to get a lot of people who will learn, who might not have learned otherwise. So this is in Oprah Daily today. I'm just going to do an excerpt because I think it speaks to what you're asking, Harold. This is Ilya speaking. A Ukrainian friend writes about spending whole nights in Kyiv subway stations, which are being used as bomb shelters, reciting poems to herself and those around her to keep sane. When she grows tired, she starts translating those poems into other languages, just as a way of keeping going. Critics in the West often ask whether poetry matters. I now realize that the only valid response to this question is, do such critics matter? If a person sheltering deep underground as her city is bombed recites poems as a survival tool to soothe herself and others, that's all the evidence I need that poetry matters. But we humans already knew that.
That's yeah.
Yeah, there's not really much else I could say, but I think that idea of the instinct of not having those words before now, but perhaps working for Amnesty International and meeting poets who wrote when they were in solitary. But I think more than that, it just instinctually does a lot of good in the world. I'll just say that.
Well, I wanted to mention, since this is an informal talk, that Alan Braden mentioned a question that I think that would be an interesting one to answer, and that is, with this new collection, there are also selected poems from your past 4 collections. How did you select the selected?
With great difficulty. There's all these books and classes you can take on how to put a poetry manuscript together. And I actually edit people's work, but there's nothing written that I found. So if you know it, please let me know on how to do a selected. And so sometimes on the internet, I get very brave, or the Jewish word is, or the Yiddish word is chutzpah. I get this chutzpah that I don't have in everyday life. And so one of the things I did was I remembered when Mark Doty was at Seattle Arts and Lectures many years ago, he spoke about putting his new and selected together. The Fire, I'm blanking on the title because I guess I am a little bit nervous. Something about the Fire. Somebody can probably put that in the chat. Anyway, he had a new and selected that won the National Book Award. So I thought, well, he probably knew what he was doing. And I remember him saying at Seattle Arts and Lectures that, you think it's going to be easy because you've already written the poems. How hard can it be? But indeed, there's a lot more to it. So I wrote him via Facebook, and I said, hi, Mark, you may remember me from X, Y, or Z, but I've been thinking about the new and selected, and I'm remembering what you said. And so he wrote me back. He's a very generous poet. Some of you already know that. And he basically wrote me a little essay about his experiences. And there were 2 things that I think are helpful if anyone's sort of thinking about doing this in the future. One of them was that the poems don't have to stay in the same order. So for example, if you look at my Cartographer's Tongue, the poem that starts the section in Gallery of Postcards and Maps is not the first poem from the Cartographer's Tongue. I rearranged them because when you take out so many poems, you want to still have some sense of cohesion. I hope that makes sense. Within the new and selected, it's a different ordering than what was in Postcards and Maps. And then the other thing he said to me is, don't bother to ask your friends. He said he wrote to his friends and said, what poem should I put in my new and selected? And the answers were like, oh, I love this poem of yours because I read it to my lover when we had our first date and we were under a willow tree. And he just said that people's responses were so personal to their own situation and circumstances that he didn't think that was particularly helpful. And then the third thing that he said that was super helpful to me is, no matter how you do this, there's going to be poems that you really wish you included and poems that you didn't necessarily need to include. So just know that that's going to happen. So I hope that helps. It was a lot more work. I also went back and did a little bit of editing, light editing on some of the older poems. And I already feel badly for the poems that didn't get to go in the book because they sort of, all of a sudden there's this privileged few, and then there's those other ones that are going to sit on the shelf. So well, it wasn't a memoir. No, it was something else with fire.
Was it Fire to Fire? Is that
Fire
right?
to Fire. That's it.
That's it. That I'll have to credit Kathleen in the chat for that.
Thank you, Kathleen. Yes. And he was very kind. And so I've just sent him a copy of the book as a thank you for his helping me.
Well, that actually, Alan's question really segues into another question that I have. If you, looking back now, if you were to rewrite one of your early poems, or maybe write a sequel to it, what would it be, and how would your perspective have changed?
So that's a tough question. Perhaps it's tough because it's one, there's just a small selection of each book that really made it into this new and selected. But it's a good question and it challenged me. And so the poem that now starts out the Cartographer's Tongue section, it's a poem called the Maperium. And it's about a place in Boston, Massachusetts that still exists, which is literally a room. It's as if there's a room, how do I say this succinctly? It's a globe. There's a stained glass globe that's big enough for you to walk inside. And you walk inside of it on a glass bridge, and you're sort of at the level of the equator. So you're kind of coming into the center of the world. And it's the way the world was, I think, 1932 when it was made. So the Baltics were all independent countries. So all those years that they weren't independent, they stayed independent. It's a snapshot of 1932. And there's a line or two in the poem that I have to say I wince at a little bit now. I still feel like the poem means something to me because I feel like that's how I saw the world. And it was the field trip that every 9-year-old goes on. So if you know anyone who lives in the Boston area, they went to the Maperium in 4th grade. So, but my sense of colonialism, imperialism, the way the world got broken up, none of that is in the poem. There's a very innocent speaker, and that innocence is maybe a privileged innocence that I might like to challenge more if I was to write it again.
Well, let me ask you, as you move from your first collection to your 5th collection, how do you think your inspirations have changed? Being at a different point in your journey as a writer, what are your current inspirations or obsessions that you have?
So my obsession with surrealist painters, we've had a relationship now, I think, for going on somewhere almost 10 years. So it hasn't abated because there's so many interesting surrealist women painters. Behind me is Leonora Carrington. On the cover of the book is a piece by Remedios Varo. Leonore Feeney is one that I've just discovered recently. So that's new in that I feel a little more comfortable talking about it. I think because I don't have an art history background, for a while I felt a strong sense of imposter syndrome. Like, who am I to bring these women up? And do I know enough about them? And finally, I'm too old to care about that part. But the other things that have come up more recently that are surprises to me, one is my Judaism, or my lapsed Judaism. If I was Catholic, I'd be a lapsed Catholic, but I'm a lapsed Jew, but you're a Jew for life. And something I never wrote about when I was younger, something I really rebelled against, but I grew up in a very Jewish community, and my house was kosher. We celebrated all the holidays. So I have this background that never interested me. And yet, maybe it's with the current situation of our country, it seemed more important to write about. And then the other thing is that often writers start by writing about their childhood, and that always bored me too, until recently. So maybe these are the things that I have enough distance from, that I see differently. Even the poem that you had me read, Harold, about nomadic life, and the fact that I have a typewriter, because at the time that I was in Peace Corps, computers weren't invented yet. So, or that they were invented, but the common person certainly didn't have them. So I think as some of us, or all of us, grow older, there's more of a sense that what we lived through is has that kind of sepia tone to it, and is something that might not be remembered if we don't write it down.
Well, out of curiosity, what you mentioned the surrealistic painters like Remedios Varo, and I noticed that it seems like there's a movement sort of that when you're much younger, and there's early poems to sort of very, very specific experiences, and that doesn't stop. But as you're moving forward, and suddenly we're sort of going through these worlds of photographs and paintings and a different era, and it sort of reminded me of like there's a Nobel laureate Egyptian writer by the name of a prose writer by the name of Naguib Mahfouz, who I adore, and his early work was known for a lot of realism, right? So he had this Cairo trilogy. You really, just beautiful, but just very much in the moment. You knew exactly time, place, location, everything. And then moving later in his career, you see this sort of jump into this sort of mythical area, in which, the themes are just as strong, but they're all of a sudden become this almost timeless Egypt, like a one slum over 10 generations, in which seems like time seems to sort of float around. And there are certain poems, that, of course, inspired by some of the surrealist painters that you're exploring, that sort of, are really, really launching in a different direction. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because the others were inspired by journeys that you're taking constantly, and all of a sudden there's a shift, perhaps around your third collection. I think maybe the Alchemist Kitchen.
Yeah. Sure. And it seems like I should probably read something, but I'll let you choose one for me to read. I would say that in some simple terms, when I was in my 20s, I changed addresses every 2 years. I changed countries. I was in Bosnia, England, Scotland, South Africa, West Africa. So there were a lot of things right outside my, window or inside my house that was very different. And I was trying to make sense of that. But now I have lived in Seattle for an incredible 22 years. And so my imagination has gone into the work of painters. My imagination gets triggered by thinking about these women who were good friends and worked together. There's a wonderful book, if you're interested in surreal painting, called Surrealist Friends. And it really documents that the friendship between Remedios Varo and Leonora Carrington and Katie Horna was fruitful for their work. And sometimes I look at a piece and I can't tell if it's Carrington or Varro because they were so close and they were looking at so many of the same themes and ideas. So I think my imagination went into the surreal painters. And I also think that the politics of our country in the last however many years, certainly during 45's term, there was so much that our lives became surreal. And I can remember being introduced to Herbert by Ilya and thinking, oh, surrealism is so interesting, but it's really something that people utilize during wartime and during extremity. And at that point, it didn't seem to be part of our lives. Of course, it may well have been, but we got an awfully huge injection with fake news and, you know, fake facts and all of that. All of a sudden, surrealism seemed to be a way that helped me understand the world that I was living in. So it's not only that I stayed in Seattle and stopped living in other countries, it's also that our lives took on more of a surreal edge. And if there's a surreal poem you want me to read, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, I would. I actually, I love this one because I'd actually love to see the painting that inspired it. but could you do vegetarian vampires walk into a bar?
I can, and somebody can probably pull up, or you can pull up if you're interested. I'm pretty sure this painting is called Vegetarian Vampires. And you'll see that, you know, I'm really not very clever. I'm just taking things from the painting that is quite hilarious. So here it is. Vegetarian vampires walk into a bar, insert straws into fruits and flowers, drink the lifeblood of a watermelon, a tomato, a 5-petaled rose. Their faces appear as expressionless as businessmen about to go under. Their new suits woven from subsidized chaffs of wheat, already frayed at the knees. From underneath twin bowler hats flash enormous golden ear wings. Perhaps they are listening to a botanist's lament for the dying or the rap of a lemon thyme. Perhaps we've arrived too late to save the world's gardens. Still, we will stage protests in alliance with the waves of grain. Underneath the vampire's bar stools, 2 pet roosters snore, their combs and wattles luminous, their speckled collars hand carved from the finest melon skins.
Thank you. Thank you. I love the sensual detail in that. I mean, it really makes me feel as if I'm I'm there with vegetarian vampires, of course. I'm going to just ask one more question before I try to open it up for other folks to ask questions. So if folks can get ready and start loading up some questions that they have in the chat, that would be fantastic. And maybe we can try to select some for season. But can you talk to me a little bit about the way in which, because with the release of this collection coming right on the tail end of COVID, and so much of your early poetry and a lot of your poetry dealing with a lot of movement, all of a sudden we were all grounded. So that was sort of this strange collective experience of being indoors and being in one place. A lot of people who were accustomed to traveling, all of a sudden not being able to travel. I see a few poems in there that reflect on this. How did that period affect you as an artist, as a writer?
Yeah, so I guess I'll admit this, and maybe some others had the same feeling. When COVID first started in March of 2020, I mean, it started before that, but when it first closed us down and our college closed and they said, oh, we'll be back in 2 weeks. And the Elliott Bay chalkboard where they say who the readers are, they still have the crossed out readers from those weeks in March of 2020. So when that happened, I kind of was enjoying being home. I felt like the entire world had gone on a writing retreat. I couldn't believe how much more time I had in my life because I wasn't commuting to Highline College every day. That meant I had at least an hour and a half more time in my life than normal. I was still teaching and I was figuring out Zoom, but it felt freeing in the beginning. And it gave me much more time to write, and I didn't feel blocked at all in the beginning. And I had Zoom dates with friends to write online. And I just felt like we were living through this historical period. I would tell my students, write down what's going on, write down making your mask out of a handkerchief or however we were doing it before you could actually buy masks, or toilet paper being gone. But then it switched, right? Then people started dying. Then people started getting infected. Then the hospitals started getting overcrowded. Then we were just home and home and home. And there was no sense of when it was going to end. And I thought, I'm getting ancient while this is happening. My youth is being sucked up by COVID. I say it in jest, but it felt that way. So eventually I found it depressing. And eventually I found it very hard to be in that, oh, we're living in this interesting time period, because really it was, we're dying in this period. But I do have a lot of poems that I wrote during that time. And I used to go on a walk every day. I live not too far from Alki Beach, so I would walk the beach every day. And I have this whole series of photographs of the signs. And, one day it would be the beach closes at, 5 p.m. tonight. They were trying to keep the beach closed once it got dark, or signs about wearing a mask, or signs about being 6 feet apart. And I guess this is a long answer, but I found that kind of rapid changing of what we believed and what we thought and how we should respond to it was something that I could kind of hold on to, because I knew that it was a very specific time. So I have a lot of poems that I wrote that are specifically about the time of living in COVID, but I don't know how many of them anyone's, there's I think 2 or 3 in the book, and I think that was the representation. Yeah.
Thank you. And if anybody has any questions for Susan, please put them in the chat, and we can try to have her answer them. I did have a request in terms of a poem for you to read. We're closing in on the end of the period altogether, and I think we talked a little bit before. I think I went to your Elliott Bay book company reading. You ended with this incredibly powerful but very optimistic poem. So I wanted to go the other direction, not not exactly opposite, but I did want to ask if you might read "Tired of Being a Woman," because I'll admit that when I read it, it really struck me.
All right. And some of you will already know that there is a poem by Pablo Neruda, "Tired of Being a Man," and that was the inspiration in part. Tired of being a woman. As it happens, I am tired of being a woman, exhausted by the bathroom scale, the carnal ins and outs of who did what to whom. I am tired of rosehip serums that the persistent cats lick off. Tired of chamomile face masks, my forehead iridescent as a lacquered carousel horse. I am tired of my country, tired of my feet, of searching for husbands like commuters claim their train cars. One in a dark and empty space, another a little off the rails. Instead, I'd prefer to be a corner store with an echoing bell of welcome. the attainable pleasures, chocolate bars, honeyed challah, yellow tulips in winter. Honestly, I am exhausted from walking home alone, past kneeling lovers, past swans. I don't want to go on paddling towards fascism in the West. I don't want another pizza to watch the fallen B stars on New Year's Eve. I can't go on as a pair of eyeglasses. I cruise the local ice cream parlors, the salons, the table linen restaurants that thrust the scent of sirloin and rum onto the sidewalk, that scarf up the mortgage payment, the safety net, the lifetime of save and save and save. All I want is the frisson that comes from an operatic sky, from another stroll at dusk. All I want, my lover's lips on the lower curve of my back. I want the shoreline where sea lions appear and almost wave to me as they warm their flippers in the briny air.
Well, I have to clap. I'd clap super loud too, if I could. I can think of no better way to close this wonderful conversation. The specificity and the beauty of the language, the blend of imagery, and the real and the surreal. So again, Susan, thank you so much for having this conversation. Thanks again to Phoebe and to Raven Chronicles for sponsoring this wonderful opportunity for writers to talk to one another. And Susan, would you like to say a few last words, parting words?
Thank you so much. Thank you to Phoebe, to Raven Chronicles, to Harold. It's been kind of a wonderful delight. You put a book together by yourself. You put a book together with incredible doubt and trepidation. And the book still feels a little bit like a stranger. We haven't gotten to know each other yet. We've only been together about a month. And so doing this event makes me feel like there's an audience for the book, that people, I saw some smiles, which is always a good thing. Right now, I can also just say that the book is, it's only out at Elliott Bay Books. Its official birthday is July 7th. So if you're interested in the book, Elliott Bay does have them. You can order online, go in, call them up, whatever. But the rest of the country is waiting until July. Of course, it is available in Ireland, should you be finding yourself there. So thank you so much.
I was depressed when I woke up this morning. Now I'm not. So this was a wonderful conversation. We could get away from the news for a little while. And I just posted our next podcast is next week. Allison Green is here. She's going to be talking to Rebecca Brown. And that's going to be on Tuesday. That'll be a wonderful conversation also at 7 o'clock. And register. If you haven't registered, please register. And I put the information in the chat. And thanks everyone for coming. This was a wonderful, wonderful event.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
you.
Have a good night.
You too.
Bye.